All right, I'm back for the Game 8 recap with National Master Dane Mattson. So we have a two-person recap for the first time. How's it going, Dane?
That's pretty well. Doing better than Jan right now, I have to say.
Yes. All right, so in this game, Magnus is playing the white pieces, Jan is playing black. Do you want to talk us through the opening a little bit and the line they chose?
Sure. So we once again see the Petrov defense, which makes sense that Magnus was playing, D4 is playing the Catalan in that sort of pseudo Catalan as white previously, and it felt like Jan was getting his fair share of chances, to say the least, with the black pieces and those lines. And although, of course, Jan lost that tragic for him marathon of a game, the opening and active middle game was certainly not to blame. So playing E4 and asking Jan, is the knight showing up, or are we going to have Petrov? I thought makes a lot of sense from White's perspective, and but Jan had an idea.
So we see knight f6 and then new idea by Magnus already on move 3, pawn to d4.
Mm-hmm.
And you were saying in the live broadcast that as a French player, you've seen this exact Petrov-like structure in the French exchange, and the only differences are the minor pieces. And coming up here after knight d7, swapping a pair of knights, there's essentially a new move by Magnus at the Grandmaster level. Knight to d2. What did you think of this when we saw it on the board?
Yeah, certainly not on my radar, but seems to be in keeping with Magnus's overall approach to some of these openings. He's not worried about having necessarily a theoretical debate and working on an objective advantage, but simply, let's get a playable position and start asking my opponent some questions they may not be prepared to answer directly. And as we'll see, it's actually Jan that's going to ask a very interesting question to Magnus in a moment. So very symmetrical position, well, completely symmetrical for a moment. And white castles, right? And then why does the natural Kingside Castling not work here, Matt?
So Kingside Castling, there's this real quick queen h5 for Magnus, hitting the h7 pawn and the d5 pawn. And we were kind of talking in the live stream. It's almost like we have two kids playing where they like to copy each other. That's exactly what we have here, and now we've reached the point where Jan cannot copy Magnus. So already this is a bit uncomfortable of a position because Jan cannot kingside castle. So we were trying to figure out, should Jan queenside castle here? But it's even not that easy to queenside castle. You probably have to start bishop e6, queen d7, long castle, but by that time, Magnus is probably going to try to open up the queen side. So here Jan surprised a lot of us and played pawn to h5, and this kind of matches the theme of the game too. Jan is playing actively. He doesn't want to go into a real passive position with bishop to e6, but it's also a double-edged move. And what does Magnus come up with here?
Yeah, it's the type of situation where you need 3 days to think about this position, like a daily chess game or something. And I'm never thinking about Magnus's move. Personally, like rook e1 feels so natural. I think we saw a line where you play queen f3 and rook a to e1 looked really concrete and maybe exactly to Jan's liking, wanting to get a fight and make the position a bit chaotic. And Magnus spent how much time here, Matt? I mean, it was an incredible amount of time.
I think this was a pretty deep think. He had an hour and 56 minutes on the clock, and then an hour and 15 after he played a 41-minute think on queen to e1 check. And h5 was also Jan's first big think. I think he spent about 20 minutes on that move.
I really like queen e1 check. It's the type of move that maybe objectively isn't the most demanding according to maybe a computer evaluation, but it felt quite practical. He's up a game. Jan plays h5. His intentions are clear. He's down a point. Let's try to embrace some chaos and get back into this match. And I think Magnus's time was well spent to come up with this queen e1, which was certainly not on my radar. But once we saw the move, you started to come up with some really good ideas for White, which is exactly what was played out in the game.
And so kind of keeping with that theme we talked about with h5 being an aggressive option for Jan, the best move here is queen to e7, actually. So we didn't run the engine while we were analyzing it. Queen e7 keeps you close to that draw territory. Jan plays a more aggressive move, king to f8. And the cool thing about this game is the concepts in this game actually apply to all levels. Sometimes Super GM games are so high up in the clouds, the stuff doesn't apply to you and I. We were talking about the bad bishops here. Bad versus good bishop. After bishop to b4, Magnus is trading his bad bishop, it's on the same color as the d pawn, for Jan's good bishop. He's forcing that trade. And in the end, we get this structure. Bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, queen d2, where again we have symmetry, but it's good bishop against bad bishop, potentially weak pawn on h5, and the king is on f8, which means the black rooks aren't connected. All of these little things add up. And even though the engine might say it's like a quarter of a pawn or half a pawn, here we go again. Same from 2 days ago. Magnus is pressing, and you might even argue a larger advantage than he had 2 days ago.
And notice he keeps the queens on the board to, we were talking about the possibility of him exchanging queens. And he keeps enough life in the position and basically gives black a nearly symmetrical position, but says, well, instead of castling, you have to move your king to f8 and you have to play h5. That makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable as black to some extent already.
Yeah. All right, so now let's fast forward a few moves. Rook to e8, Magnus challenges. This rook comes out via h6. And now we see a very nice move by Magnus. And both Dane and I love to pressure the opponents. I think we like the word pressure more than anything, but you really want to keep your opponent feeling a little uncomfortable. And look what Magnus is doing. This queen hits the weak h5 pawn, hits the d5 pawn, eyes the d8 square with back rank ideas. And I think already we were starting to feel like, okay, this is not very comfortable for Jan at all. So he plays c6. Magnus swaps one set of rooks, knowing that the other rook can gain control of the e-file. We see a queen trade offer, and Magnus says, I'm not going to trade queens. I see you're attacking the d-pawn. I'm going to calmly play queen to e3. And at this point, we knew it was game on, right? Magnus is going to press, and he played h3 here. What did you think of this move during the game?
Well, it's one of those impressions, where if a 1600 is looking at the position, they don't know what to do. There might be a tendency to like play h3 or some sort of committal pawn move. I didn't like it initially. But it was mostly maybe a lack of my understanding was that to me, it seemed like an unnecessary provocation that maybe g5, g4 could be in the air. But I think Magnus analyzed that correctly, which is trying to provoke Jan, and that's sort of maybe another theme in this game, provoke him into unnecessary aggression when Jan has to just sit and try to just hang tough and not create any more weaknesses. So I think that'll play out here in the game.
Yeah, and after h4, the move that really impressed me, because I didn't see it coming, was pawn to c4. Once you see pawn to c4 from the black perspective, you don't really want to allow white to take on d5, because when you take back with the c-pawn, then you end up with a weak pawn on d5 that the white bishop can reroute and attack, and it also opens up the c-file for white to use. So this already puts Jan in a really tough spot, and he ended up taking on c4, and now the dynamic of the position changes to a more wide open position, but we see this threat of queen to a3 check, as well as the pressure down the e-file, and we actually get the first kind of big mistake of the game by Jan. He plays pawn to b5 here. I mean, what do you think of pawn to b5?
If it works, great. But again, the theme being black is not justified in playing this way. h3, creating some loof for the king was quite useful. The position is starting to open up. And why should black be optimistic in counterplay at this exact moment? It's not entirely clear that this is justified. And it's pretty hard to find a move like king g8 as Jan.
Mm-hmm.
Just sit, avoid the vulnerability on that exposed diagonal, which we'll see in the game. And again, Magnus gives his opponent the opportunity to lash out.
And this is something that you see a lot at the club level too, right? You give your opponent those chances to make mistakes, and across all levels, Super GM down to beginners, it's very hard to just sit on a position and do nothing. Sergei Karyakin is very good at it, which might have been partially why he had some success against Magnus in the classical. But Jan was not able to find king g8, makes the first mistake b5, and Magnus gets his queen a3 check-in, forking the king and the a pawn, and he was able to calculate that after king g8, queen takes a7, Jan's actually just losing a pawn here. But what was your line that you looked at during the live stream for black?
Well, I thought in keeping with once you play b5 and you're entering this chaotic position, is just keep muddying the waters with a move like bishop h3 and have a debate between these desperado bishops.
Yeah, and this was the top engine move as well. Bishop takes h3. So it's interesting. It's almost like Jan can't decide aggressive or solid, right? Like aggressive was b5, and then all of a sudden he just abandoned ship and did not play bishop takes h3. But maybe it's go ahead.
Oh, I just want to say, in fairness, we weren't using an engine during our live analysis, and I thought we came across a pretty nice line where Magnus is able to simplify the position and suggest a very unpleasant prospect for black to face after this rook e8 move that we were discussing in the live analysis.
Yeah, so we utilized the pin of the queen. After king h7, bishop takes, this bishop has to move to safety. And then we looked at we have to pat ourselves on the back. We looked at this exact line without an engine. Rook e5, and black's already in some really big trouble here. The engine does say about a pawn and a half, so it's not completely lost for Jan. At least he's fighting, but this feels very comfortable for white. Blockading the c pawn with rook c5, maybe bishop to e8, attacking that pawn again. And black has to move the f8 bishop currently or defend it. So I think it's very close to a win already for Magnus still, but Jan should have at least tried something like this instead of going into that passive game, which was an even worse eval.
And it's so difficult having the memory of being tortured, in game 6, and then realizing that this position is even going to be worse and less pleasant to try to hold. Psychologically, that's a very tough task to adopt for Jan.
Yeah. So he retreated the queen to d8, playing passively. We see bishop to b3. And now, again, this happens at all levels. A lot of times, mistakes and blunders come in pairs or sets of 3, where you see a couple mistakes right in a row. Happens here to Jan. And one tip that I have for improving players, when you make a mistake and you know you made a mistake, if you feel yourself emotional about it, get up from the board and walk around a little bit. Go get a glass of water. Go to the restroom. Go watch a couple other games. But you really want to clear your mind and come back to this board from a fresh perspective. And I'm wondering if Jan was, had that game 6 in the back of his mind. He knew he made a mistake allowing queen a3 check here, winning the pawn, and it caused him to blunder again. Because here he has rook to h5, which kind of prevents this rook to e5 idea for Magnus. But instead he plays rook to d6, which was another mistake. And after rook e4, all of a sudden Magnus is pressuring the h-pawn, guarding the d-pawn, still has 2 pieces eyeing the pawn on f7, and Jan's busted now. Like, it's already a winning position, and Magnus doesn't really look back from here on out.
So, yeah. Once we saw this and we started to discuss if you and I are perhaps playing as black will be the Count and the Duke to Magnus's Morphy, can we somehow hold, play bishop e6 and hang tough? And it was exactly what Jan attempted in the game. So well, the good news, Matt, is you and I can lose like a 2800 GM.
Yes.
So we must be doing something, right?
Well, I think we mentioned too, we wanted to have a situation from the black side where maybe it's just a queen and pawns with perpetual check chances, or just a rook and pawn, because sometimes those can be drawish, rook and pawn endgames. So we see bishop e6. Everything gets swapped off. And look at this move by Magnus, queen to c5. What's so good about queen to c5 for viewers that maybe are wondering, why is that such a strong move?
Yeah, I mean, we have that backward pawn on c6. And if, give black another move before queen c5, maybe Jan's ready to play queen d5, centralize the queen, start to create some pressure. But once you play queen c5, it's just a boa constrictor, sort of Karpovian strategy of squeezing black. offering an exchange of queens with queen d5 would, reach an unfortunate king and pawn ending, that we should be avoiding at all costs. And once exactly right with the pass pawn on the queen side. So basically, queen c5 really condemns Jan to passive play. And there's these weaknesses that are very hard to defend. We have the isolated e6 pawn, the backward c6 pawn, h4 is a liability. And this is just grim. I don't know how to describe it in any other term.
And I really liked your point about centralizing the queen. Queen upon endgames, centralizing the queen is the first priority. And here what Jan did, I think, made a lot of sense for our level as well. He said, okay, I know I'm worse, and at this point it doesn't make sense to play passive. I'm so much worse that I'm going to lose. So he plays queen to a5, and he's looking for this counterplay. Queen to e1 check, or maybe he'll take on the a2 and try to start gaining some pawns back that way. But he has nothing to lose at this point. The game is already going to be a loss, so he plays actively. But Magnus's calculation was just on point here. He figured out, I can allow the check on e1, move the king to h2, and then he grabs this pawn with check, checks again, and now this move really impressed us. Pawn to b3. That's his way of defending the queenside pawns. Let me flip the board again. Yeah, what did you think about pawn to b3? Why was this move so good?
That was just wonderful. I mean, and you discussed the importance of centralization, and that if the queen moves to a2 to capture the pawn, it's suddenly offside. There's no obvious way to attack Magnus's king. And I think, you came up with a variety of good moves here for white, including just queen d5 or queen e8, and just, collecting the pawn on b5, also protecting b3. And that's the point about centralization, is you can control both sides of the board, and the queen is so dynamic and able to travel quickly on any side of the board, from the center, especially where black's queen is a sad spectator on a2, just observing events, not able to control it.
And Jan really only has two different ideas here, two different paths to get perpetual check. One is this diagonal pointing at the king, and the other is the first rank. So as long as Magnus can stop one of those types of checks, his king should always be safe. And here he plays queen to e5, defending the diagonal. And after queen to b2, we see queen to e4 check, and queen to d3. And I really like this idea for Magnus, because now the queen is behind the pawn, so this gets very easy to push, and he's actually allowing Jan to potentially check from the f4 square. So we see queen f2, queen c3, and this is something that's not natural, allowing your opponent this check. But he realized after the check there's no more checks for black, and now the pawns are ready to roll up the board, especially the b pawn. It's ready to push. King to h7 played by Jan, and then queen back to d3 check, g6. And what did you think about Jan's play here with the g pawn? And it's kind of his last-ditch attempt to make a little bit of play.
Yeah, I mean, you're only going to lose this game once, and just continuing to just push forward here. There's no risk. Ask some questions that, for less experienced players, white could get nervous. Obviously at this level, Magnus had no problem neutralizing this, but for improving players, when I see a move like h3, I would get a little bit nervous. But Magnus just plays a lights out move here, queen f3.
And we saw instant resignation from Jan after queen to f3. And just to highlight why, let's say h takes g2, king takes g2, queen check. The king can pretty comfortably hide on a square like h3, and Magnus is up 3 pawns, and it's really not difficult at all at their level to have the technique to get those pawns promoted. So what a game by Magnus. Comes back with a win 2 days after that 8-hour grind, and now Jan is down 2 games for the rest of the match. So what are your thoughts for openings going forward?
Yeah, great question. I certainly would not be happy to see another anti-Marshall at this point from Jan. I would, we discussed the possibility of the Scotch, the Italian, and then my favorite is C4. Play the English, but on the other hand, there's always different questions to answer. If you play C4, what if Magnus invites a Queen's Gambit declined with E6?
Mm-hmm.
So there's no solution here necessarily, but you must continue, right? There's no clear path, but we're continuing, and I don't sympathize with Jan's task, but he's always a dangerous opponent, and he has nothing to lose now.
Yeah, I think it'll make the rest of the match really exciting because I don't think Jan wants to just go down quietly at this point. He's going to try to fight, and I think all of the games going forward should be pretty interesting because of that. All right, so
And credit
that's
to Jan for playing H5, by the way, that with that attitude of I'm not just going to try to play passively and take a draw. I'm trying to mix things up. I'm not resigning this world championship match. I'm playing for a win. And credit to Magnus that he spent, like you said, over 40 minutes in this Queen E1 move. Again, there's certain evaluations where maybe you're looking at zeros on the bar. And for Magnus, his approach is once I see zeros, if it's not a forced draw, it's balanced. This is where my opening prep begins, not ends.
yeah, I think that's the move of the game. Queen E1 check that really started out everything that caused problems for Jan going forward. And I think he used the fact that Jan doesn't want to draw against him, right? He saw
Exactly.
H5. Maybe Magnus knew Queen E7 was closer to a draw. But I'm guessing if he saw Queen E7, he's not going to trade Queen so easily, or he'll look for something else just to be a bit annoying and apply some pressure. But yeah, I was super impressed. Queen E1 and another really good game by Magnus, start to finish. All right, so that concludes our recap. Game number 8. I want to thank Dane for joining for the live stream and the first two-person recap. Let us know in the comments what you think of the recap or if you have any questions, and we'll get back to you. Dane, do you have any last words?
No, just really enjoyed my time working together, and just very enjoyable, instructive conversation. I think I learned quite a bit today, and looking forward to seeing what happens for the remainder of the match.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and we will see you in the next recap.